My name is Kimberly Marten. I'm a professor of political science at Barnard College here at Columbia, and I'm also the director of the U.S. Russia Relations program here at the Harriman Institute at Columbia. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our conference on U.S. Russia Relations in the Arctic. I hope you all noticed that I ordered the weather especially for this conference. It's about as close as New York City gets to the Arctic, and so I think it's very appropriate to put us in the mood today. What we are going to have today is really an extraordinary event. It's a set of the most top scholars and top analysts in the world who are coming from a variety of disciplinary perspectives, and it's a very international group. And as we go forward, you can read their full biographies in the program that I hope you all managed to pick up outside. But I just want to introduce our first panel to set the scene today. So I'll just quickly go down the four speakers that we will be having this morning first. So first we have Marlene Laruelle, who is a research professor of international affairs and the associate director of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. She hails originally from Paris, and she has been trained in an incredibly interdisciplinary way in political science, in history, and in area studies in Paris. So that's the perspective that she will bring. Her biography that's listed in the program does not do the full span of her research work justice. In addition to being an expert on the Arctic, she's an expert on just about everything else related to Russia, including Russian foreign policy, and most recently also some work on Russian philosophy and Eurasianism and neo-Eurasianism and what it means for Putin's foreign policy choices. She'll be followed by Paul Berkman, who is a professor of practice in science diplomacy at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He is trained as a biologist and oceanographer, just to make sure that we get a very interdisciplinary perspective on things. Next, we'll have Caitlyn Antrim, who is the executive director of the Rule of Law Committee for the Oceans at the Stimson Center in Washington, and she is trained as an engineer. And last but not far from least, we'll have Alexander Sergunin, who originally comes from Nizhny Novgorod, where he was trained as a historian, and he is now a professor of international relations at the Department of International Theory and History at the School of International Relations at St. Petersburg State University in Russia, and he also teaches at the Higher School of Economics branch in St. Petersburg in Russia. So let's start with Marlene to get things started, and welcome everyone.
Thank you, Kimberly, for your very kind introduction. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for having us here today with you in New York. So this first panel is about kind of setting the scene, and I'm the first one. I will be kind of setting the scene of the scene, and I decided to give you a kind of short presentations of the main 3 points that I consider are important if we want to address the Russian perspective on looking at the Arctic. So my first point may be a little bit kind of elephant in the room, but I'm the first one opening the discussion. I think that's my job to do that. If we look at the Arctic region, Russia is really the key actor of the region, not only because of its geography. It has half of the Arctic territories are Russian territory. Almost half of the Arctic coast are Russians. More than 60% of the population living in the Arctic are Russian citizens. So that's important elements. More than 20% of the Russian GDP is produced in Arctic region. So Russia is really one of the key Arctic players. But Russia is important not only because of its geography, it's also important because it can shape the strategic landscape of the regions. Remember 1986 when Gorbachev had this Murmansk speech that ended the Cold War in the Arctic and opened for international cooperation. Remember a few years ago, Vladimir Putin calling for making the Arctic a territory of dialogue, 2008, 9, 2010, 11. That resulted in something very important, which was the search and rescue circumpolar agreement that was signed between the 5 circumpolar countries. But also, reversely, Russia can also play a big role in cooling the international cooperation in the Arctic, in making the region not really immune from what else is going on the international scene. And we have seen that recently with the Ukrainian crisis. The Russian leadership was hoping that Arctic cooperation will not be touched by the cooling of the West-Russia relations because of the Ukrainian issue, but it was because Arctic is not an isolated region of the world. There are several specificities of Russia's Arctic policy that make it a different actor from the rest of the Arctic countries. One I think is very important that we tend to forget when we look at through the U.S. prism is that for Russia, the Arctic, it's mostly a land-based issue, not so much a sea-based. It's a land-based issue because Arctic is an integral part of Siberia, and Siberia is an integral part of the Russian territory. So it's very much a domestic look that Russia is having at the Arctic, discussing the issues of connectivities of this huge massland to the European region of the country. And the second important element is that climate change is not the big driver, as you may know, of Russia's strategy in the region, and therefore when we tend to focus discussion on the Arctic around climate change, that puts Russia in a kind of difficult position because seen from the Russian perspective, that's really not what is driving its strategy in the region. And that will make me coming to my second point, which is more looking at the domestic side. I always thought that Russia's policy in the Arctic, it's mostly a domestic issues first, before being a foreign policy one. The Arctic is always mentioned by the Russian state as one of the critical regions at the same level as the North Caucasus and the Far East, among part of this region that the Russian state want to fund, want to secure, want to support. At the same time, that's the narrative. If you look more concretely, you will see that it's much more difficult. First, Arctic cities or Arctic regions in Russia didn't really succeed in making the state budget, funding them a lot compared to the North Caucasus, because in fact, of course, what is more important for Russia's security is the North Caucasus and not the Arctic. Then there have been endless debates about creating a centralized administration for all the Arctic region in Russia, and it failed because it would be very difficult to create such kind of super centralized administration. But you still have this kind of Soviet perception that to be functional, you need a centralized administration. Then it has been relatively difficult to identify which Arctic territories should be considered as Arctic and which kind of benefits they can get. And it's also make things complicated because economic dynamics are mostly south and north. So I'll show you just two maps. This is the maps of the territory that Russia considered as Arctic or near Arctic. So the dark blue ones are those who are considered as Arctic, and the light blue ones are those who are considered as having equivalent condition to Arctic regions. So you can see it's the majority of the Russian territory with the exception of European region and the Trans-Siberian, which make, in fact, the definition of Arctic sometimes relatively similar to the definition of Siberia. And as I said, what is really important in looking at Arctic's conception on the Russian side is that it's very much based, in fact, on the south-north dynamic. So, in fact, Arctic issues in the Far Eastern Federal District, Arctic issues in the Siberian, the Ural, or the Northwest District are totally different. And all these Arctic regions have much more connection to the southern part of their federal district that they have between one another among the Arctic region. Another key element that makes Russia really a specific country in the Arctic region is that it's the outpost of Arctic urbanization. Arctic urbanization is growing everywhere in the region, but Russia is far away in terms of urbanization. It has 6 cities that are between 100 and 300,000 inhabitants, which is really huge. That means that the Russia's Arctic policy, it's much more looking at issues related to sustainability, energy delivery, connectivity. That's some example of the thawing of permafrost and the issues it can create in the Arctic. So that's really an important look, which is very specific to the Russia's position. Another important and related element is that indigenous issues are really of small importance for the Russian side. Only 5% of Russia's Arctic population are indigenous people. 95% are just Russians, urban population, which also put Russia kind of on the side when we have Arctic discussion that are mostly around the rights of indigenous people. And the last point I wanted to discuss today is moving from the policies of the Arctic policies to Arctic politics. The region is a very personalized one. It's often seen as the embodiment of Putin's regime. So Putin himself, Medvedev, several people really close members of the inner circle are the kind of big figure of the Russian state in the Arctic. You can see Dmitry Rogozin, deputy prime minister in charge of the military-industrial complex, a big voice on the Arctic. Sergei Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, Patrushev, who was also very influential, especially a few years ago on Arctic issues. All these personalities are members of the security services or the security services culture. They are all very close to Putin. Some of them played a key role in the revival of the Russian Geographical Society, which has been transformed into one of the instruments of Russia's revived cultural soft power in the Arctic. What does that mean to have this Russian leadership very much involved in Arctic issues? It means two things. The first one is that narratives about the Arctic in Russia are very much for domestic audience consumption. And I think we should try to not forget that. The drawing you can see on the right side of the screen is the Russian polar bear saying that Arctic is only for white people, while Obama is coming. So that, and this one is showing you the very nationalist narrative which is growing in some intellectual circles or political circles with the fact that the Arctic should be a Russian place. I think it's important to remember that Arctic issues are really, an Arctic narrative are very much for domestic audience. Make a comparison with the Canadian narrative, which is also a very nationalist one, and it's also mostly for domestic audience. So that's an important element of the discussion. Another important element, I think, is that for Russia's Arctic policy, it's very much an issue of branding, of prestige, and also of business. Of branding and prestige, because it's very important for Russia to be recognized as the big power in the Arctic. Of business, because, and that's something that maybe we will be rediscussing this afternoon when we will have the military issues panel, is that Russia is reviving its military activities in the Arctic, not only for war or tensions-related issue, it's reviving it because it needs to revive the military-industrial complex, because that's a big business for many members of Putin's inner circle. So there is a clear economic purpose in reviving the military economic sector, also because the military are more or less the only people in Russia who can make some very remote Arctic territory usable in terms of energy supply and so on. So that's something we should take into consideration. And I will, before stopping, I just wanted to mention, I mentioned in my introduction the Ukrainian crisis, just wanted to mention, of course, another important country that I hope we will be somewhere bringing into the discussion, which is, of course, China. Our day is about the U.S. and Russia in the Arctic, but of course China is the kind of third unformulated, unsaid element that is really important for Russia. It's really one of the big issues of this kind of permanent strategic dilemma between looking toward the West or toward China, and China is playing an incredibly growing role in the Arctic, and on the way also Russia will have to negotiate its partnership with China in the years to come in the Arctic. So this was my kind of overview, and now I will give the floor to the second speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlene, for that terrific overview. And just as a reminder, if you didn't see it in the news this week, Russia officially, before the United Nations, asserted its ownership of the continental shelf extending under the North Pole. So it's not new that they are making that kind of a territorial claim, but I believe the claim is slightly larger than it has been in the past. And simultaneously, the Ministry of Defense in Russia released a video that showed soldiers with machine guns riding on reindeer sleighs through the Arctic. So Russia is also cooperating with making the Arctic a big issue just in time for this conference. So now Paul Berkman, who is, in addition to his academic work, has been an explorer in the Arctic and also a business owner who's involved in things there. So, Paul.
I understand that the discussion today is about the Arctic and Russia. I'd like to think more broadly in terms of building common interests in the Arctic. The challenges that we face today in the Arctic are not limited to today, and the decisions we make today will have repercussions potentially centuries into the future. So I'd like to take a step back and look at the world we live in. About 30% of the surface of the planet falls within the boundaries of nations, defined in terms of national interests. The history of our civilization is written in terms of national interests. About 70% of the Earth falls beyond the boundaries of nations in areas explicitly defined as international space, in a sense, common interests. Arguably, the single challenge we face as a civilization is one of balancing national interests and common interests. If we look at the 20th century itself, the first part of the 20th century was marked by animosity among nations. The second part of the 20th century can be defined in terms of hope, in terms of decisions and institutions that brought nations together to consider environmental and regions beyond sovereign jurisdictions, starting with the high seas in 1958, Antarctica in 1959, outer space in 1967, and the deep sea in 1971. If we, in fact, we look at the 20th century itself, the first half of the 20th century is defined in terms of national interests, and with a bit of hope and inspiration, the second part can be defined in terms of common interests. So, in terms of the Arctic, productive Russian collaboration is necessary, and thinking in terms of division and problems that exist in the Arctic with Russia are itself problems. Nonetheless, having said that, there is reality that there is escalating tensions in the Arctic. The title below is an op-ed that I wrote with former Foreign Minister of Canada and Oren Young in the Huffington Post just before the U.S. took over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council. So there is an issue of escalating tensions in the Arctic, but the challenge is to reel that back and to think in terms of the Arctic as an insulated place on the planet. It was mentioned earlier in the previous speech, the discussion that was introduced by Mikhail Gorbachev in 1987, and I think it's an important speech. If you haven't read this speech, it's actually remarkable in that a head of state was not thinking only in terms of national interests, but he was thinking much more broadly in terms of common interests. Therefore, while in Murmansk and standing on the threshold of the Arctic and the North Atlantic, I would like to invite, first of all, the countries of the region to a discussion on the burning security issues. Arguably, those burning security issues that were relevant to Gorbachev in 1987 have never disappeared. They have been the elephant in the room. And so looking at the discussion today in terms of something that's unique and sudden is probably not correct. The discussion in terms of burning security issues have always been there. Gorbachev went on to talk about let the North Pole be a pole of peace. He further identified a number of strategies, and all of his strategies have come to be. He talked about scientific exploration, peaceful development, cooperation in the Arctic. He talked about special importance of environmental protection, and he talked about setting up of an Arctic Research Council, which became the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council itself is a high-level forum among the Arctic states and indigenous peoples to develop strategies relating to common Arctic issues, in particular issues of sustainable development and environmental protection. The asterisk is actually in the Ottawa Declaration from 1996, which talks about the Arctic Council should not deal with matters related to military security. So in effect, if we think in terms of peace and stability, there are two elements that are required. One is promoting cooperation, which the Arctic Council does admirably. The other is to prevent conflict. And I would argue that the Arctic Council as a high-level forum has actually been complacent in not effectively dealing with issues to prevent conflict. If we look at the Arctic in terms of the circumstances that we face today, the Arctic is going through an environmental state change from a permanent sea ice cap that has been there for thousands and tens of thousands of years, multi-year sea ice that has basically paved the surface of the Arctic Ocean, to a region that is seasonally ice-free. And so if we look at that, in effect, it's like this room. The room has a floor, it has walls, it has a ceiling, it has inflow and outflow through the door. No different than the Arctic. We've got sea floor, we've got continents on the surrounding, we've got inflow and outflow through the North Atlantic and North Pacific, and we've got a sea ice cap. If I remove the ceiling to this room, I guarantee everybody would not be sitting comfortably in the chairs. We'd begin to move around. And in effect, by removing the surface of the sea ice in the Arctic Ocean, we're changing the Arctic Ocean system. It's a new system. The boundary, the surface boundary of the Arctic Ocean has been removed. And as a consequence, there is now a seasonally ice-free sea. But more importantly, because the Arctic sea ice boundary has been removed, it is introducing risks of instability. Not potential, but inherent risks of instability in the region, risks of political, economic, and cultural instability. And if you look at any security dialogue, national security, military security, food security, energy security, cybersecurity, it doesn't matter what the flavor of security is, they all deal with issues of risks of instability, political, economic, and cultural. And the Arctic is exposed to risks of instability. So there is a security consideration in the Arctic today. In terms of bridging the dialogue between the United States, Russia, NATO, and so on, in 2010 I convened a meeting at the University of Cambridge that was the first formal dialogue between NATO and Russia regarding security in the Arctic Ocean. The intention was to begin to think about these risks and to begin to think in terms of preventing conflict in the Arctic Ocean, explicitly defined in terms of environmental security as an integrated approach for assessing and responding to the risks as well as the opportunities generated by an environmental state change. We have a new Arctic Ocean. In a sense, the world is being introduced to a new ocean on Earth. It's a profound period, and we have significant responsibilities in responding appropriately. I mentioned that the circumstances in the Arctic have been ongoing, and probably the most telling is the testing of submarine-launched ballistic missiles. The surface profiles of militaries in the Arctic, boots on the ground, airplanes, helicopters, horses, and so on, are trivial in comparison to the risks that exist because of submarine-launched ballistic missile capacity that has been in the Arctic since the early 60s. Now, this is a very difficult topic to discuss, and one that was introduced in the NATO workshop, which was co-hosted by Russia. So Russia actually took a very ambitious step in 2010 in thinking together with NATO about environmental security in the Arctic Ocean. But bear no mistake, the significant risk in the Arctic, the elephant in the room, has been the presence of nuclear submarines with ballistic missile capacity that has been there since the 1960s, that have capacity to attack Russia, the United States, Europe, Asia, from the Arctic. So if we look at the Arctic today and the situation where we're going and where we've been, so starting with the period of Gorbachev on the far left, we went through a period up to about 2007 where there was relatively modest activity in terms of the Arctic Ocean region. In 2007, Arturo Chirlingarov and a crew planted a flag at the bottom of the North Pole on the sea floor, 4,000 meters below the surface. And that was an awakening. And suddenly nations began to define national security policies regarding the Arctic. And so you can see the number of policies. You don't have to understand what they are, just in terms of a change. That from 2007 forward, there has been increased international attention in the Arctic. Nationally, policies emerging with relation to security issues, internationally in terms of a bunch of other discussions. So I'd like to dwell on this concept of phases in the Arctic. And where we are today is we're going through a phase from research into sustainable development. The Arctic Council itself has 6 working groups, and those 6 working groups have effectively all focused on the common Arctic issue of sustainable development. Where we are today is there's now an emerging dialogue about investment in sustainable development. That investment is reflected in terms of the Arctic Economic Council, which emerged during the Canadian chairmanship. It's also reflected in terms of the World Economic Forum coming up with an Arctic investment protocol, and groups like Guggenheim Partners, which have $330 billion under management, are championing investment in the Arctic. So we're going from a phase of research into sustainable development to a phase of investment in sustainable development. If we look at the concept of economics in the Arctic, in a curious way, the economics of the Arctic are actually a driver of stability. Russia has no mistake that it is the biggest economic beneficiary in the Arctic, has the largest coastline in the Arctic, has vast amounts of oil and gas in the continental shelf. It has the Northern Sea Route, which is turning on. It has potential fisheries and everything else associated with the opening of the Arctic. Russia recognizes that it's an economic beneficiary, and a lot of the discussion is focused on positioning Russia toward the future in the Arctic. In a sense, Russia would be compromising its economic future to have an unstable region. Stability of the Arctic is actually in Russia's interest. So I would argue that, in a sense, in a curious way, the economics of the Arctic is actually a driver, a potential driver of stability in the region. If we look at what the Arctic will emerge and how we effectively facilitate sustainability of the region, in order to allow for shipping and energy extraction and fisheries and other things to mature in a sustainable way, concept of sustainable, balanced environmental, economic, social perspectives. In effect, there are two elements. One are built elements, elements that are associated with construction of ports and ships and communication systems and research systems, observing systems and the like. And the other are governance mechanisms, institutions, agreements, policies, and so on. And I would argue that the concept of infrastructure isn't relegated to just the built elements, that in order to facilitate sustainability, it's a combination of both the built and the governance mechanisms together. For example, the concept of a search and rescue agreement was identified in 2011, or a pollution prevention agreement in 2013. Those are perfectly good agreements in terms of concepts and strategy and anticipating changes. But in the absence of the actual built elements to implement them, those agreements are hollow. Similarly, if we have groups of icebreakers around the Arctic owned by many different countries, they're not coordinated, there's no cooperation, there's no consistency of application, they're not going to achieve anything sustainable either. So in terms of thinking about what the infrastructure will look like or could look like in the Arctic, it's a combination of both built and governance mechanisms. It will involve public-private partnerships, and in that sense, one of the sectors that has largely been avoided, if not entirely ignored, in terms of business in the Arctic is a service sector. A service sector that allows for emergency response, safety of life at sea issues, pollution preparedness and response, etc., as well as servicing the different types of activities, shipping, energy, so on. It turns out that the service sector is right at the interface between governance and built and has the potential for return on investment. So the service sector is actually teed up as a potential beneficiary of this investment, and in a way that would contribute to sustainability of the region. So the overriding concept of the Arctic, particularly the Arctic Ocean, so when we talk about the Arctic, it's a bit ambiguous. There are national areas that fall within the sovereign jurisdiction of nations, largely land areas, and it is inappropriate for any international body beyond that nation to think about how those nations operate in their national territories. The area where there's intersection is the Arctic Ocean. It is the Arctic Ocean that is where there is overlap between nations in terms of resources, impacts, and issues. And so all of the issues in the Arctic Ocean fall within the law of the sea. The law of the sea progresses from the national boundary through a territorial sea and contiguous zone to an exclusive economic zone, which fall within national jurisdictions. Beyond the exclusive economic zone, in the water column, is the high seas. And the high seas is unambiguously beyond sovereign jurisdiction. These zones in the water column are independent of any zones on the sea floor. The sea floor has continental shelf, which falls within the sovereign jurisdiction of a nation, and beyond the continental shelf on the sea floor is the deep sea. Arguably, if the entire Arctic Ocean fell within the jurisdiction on the sea floor, there would still be high seas in the center of the Arctic Ocean. So in effect, the law of the sea provides a continuum from national interests to common interests. So again, going back to the theme that building common interests is a critical element in terms of the Arctic, and I would argue globally. The challenge we face as a civilization is one of balancing national interests and common interests. It was mentioned in the previous talk, the notion of the extension of the seafloor. The seafloor, in terms of the continental shelf extension, is proceeding under the rules of law as identified in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Article 76 provides for a commission on the limits of the continental shelf. That commission doesn't adjudicate who owns the continental shelf. It only defines whether it is continental shelf. So, for example, the Lomonosov Ridge in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, it might be continental shelf, but then is it continental shelf of Europe or of Asia? Questions will then require bilateral, multilateral discussions between the United States, Canada, and Denmark. If we look at the seafloor, in effect, the seafloor is a region where nations are looking inward into the Arctic Ocean in terms of their national interests. I would argue that the contrast to that, is that the high seas is an opportunity for the international community to look outward in terms of their common interests. So in terms of the Arctic as a region and the discussions about Russia, and I'm sure that we will hear military components and there will be buttons of concern and worry that will be introduced and so on. I think that strategy going forward, there is no solution in the Arctic in the absence of Russian cooperation. Russian cooperation is critical to any sustainable solutions in the Arctic. So there is no ifs, ands, or buts about how to proceed other than to try and figure out what that cooperation looks like. The seafloor could be continental shelf all the way up to the North Pole within the boundaries of nations. There will still be high seas in the center. And there is an opportunity in the Arctic to balance national interests and common interests. And I would argue that any solution that we as a generation make with regard to the Arctic today will resonate with repercussions decades, if not centuries, into the future of how we balance national interests and common interests on a global scale. Thank you.
I had a boss one time who never spoke from behind a podium, and when he was asked why, he said he hated to be a sitting duck. He wanted to be a moving target. Personally, I find this a little large for somebody my height, so I'm going to speak from here. And I want to speak a bit about the changing perspective of Russia and the world as a result of the Arctic. And here's just a nice chart. What this said to me was, when we talk about the Arctic, we have definitions of the Arctic Circle, the Arctic Ocean, the 10-degree thermocline. But we're really talking about an Arctic watershed. And almost all of Russian Eurasia drains into the Arctic. So even if you're in the warm southern part, you have an interest in the connections up to the north. I want to cover 5 things in 12 minutes. So this is, I almost wore sneakers for this. Geostrategy toward Russia in the last century, Arctic change and a new strategic approach. I want to give you a quick vision of why I'm looking at the Russian Arctic differently, Russia's maritime strategy, and opportunities for cooperation. I'm going to be much more narrow in focus than Paul was, and hopefully I'll be consistent with him because he did a good job, very good job on the law of the sea aspects, which I normally have to dwell on too much myself. The evolution of geostrategy in the 20th century began in 1900 with Alfred Thayer Mahan, the great naval strategist, who talked about the problem with Asia and noted that it was possible to enclose Russia simply with the Turkey, East Asia, and the frozen north. 4 years later, Halford Mackinder talked about the importance of the Eurasian heartland, the threat it had historically posed to Europe, but he noted that the northern part was protected by the icy sea. 1943, Nicholas Bickman, one of the great geostrategists, talked about the heartland, the rimland, the importance of enclosure and containment against the Soviet Union. And even in 1997, after the Soviet Union has fallen, Zbigniew Brzezinski was still talking about Russia as how do you enclose it in the the West with Europe, in the Southeast, in the South, and through the Asian East. But soon after that, we saw well, these were the assumptions. There was always the assumption that Russia was going to push outward, not inward, that it was going to expand even if it required force, that sea access by Russia would only increase their ability to move outward, and that it was possible through these narrow choke points to enclose Russia. So that really defines a century of looking at Russia from the Western maritime nation perspective. I love this quote from Berkman, though, that geography is the most fundamental factor in foreign policy because it is the most permanent. Not anymore. As you see, as Paul said, the seasonal opening of the Arctic provides that access that if Russia had had this 100 years before, they might have not lost their war to Japan. They could have moved their fleets together and rather than being losing battles piecemeal. And the passage is not an unimpeded one. When we say ice-free, we mean big chunks of ice still floating in it. If you are a sailor, you know that a big chunk of ice is in an even bigger submerged chunk of ice, and it's dangerous. But still, there are ways to deal with that. Paul showed this presentation. I modified it to put Russia at the top, but I want to identify a few things because as much as we have a legal regime, all legal regimes have to be resolved through individual conflicts and dispute resolution. Russia's at the top. You see that blue that borders countries. That's where nations claim internal waters, where their control over the water is every bit as unimpeded as control over the land. Not like the territorial sea, where they have to provide a right of innocent passage. And for Russia, you might notice that that blue extends in between some islands. And those islands are pretty far from shore. The New Siberian Islands, the Northern Islands, and that's going to be an issue to be resolved in the future as this becomes more accessible, as the ice melts further. But we don't have to deal with it right now. The same with Canada. They claim the waters inside their archipelago as internal waters. We claim that it's an international strait. So actually, I was a little worried when Russia and Canada started mending their fences because that gives them a lot of leverage on making their argument of internal waters when they can argue together. We talked about the Lomonosov Ridge, and that's the big issue that's facing the UN Commission, it's not the UN Commission, the Law of the Seas Convention's Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. 10 years ago, the United States sent notes in saying, oh, we don't believe this. And then about 2010, the US said the position has evolved, the understanding of the geography has evolved. And in fact, if Russia and Denmark and soon Canada show that that part, which we call a ridge, but it appears to be a segment of continental shelf that was split off by plate tectonic actions, that will become under the control of states rather than the authority of the International Seabed Authority for the international seabed. However, it's not exactly valuable real estate. It's probably more important for who it excludes than who gets control. We know that it will fall either to Russia, Denmark, or Canada. It will not fall to non-Arctic states, which is probably good for all of us. The countries that are close to it have a greater sense of the importance of managing it sustainably, if it ever is managed. One of the things that I started thinking about was looking at it this way, because I'm an American. I know rivers do not run north. We've got one river in the United States that people know about, the Red River, that runs north. Everything else runs south. So when I looked at the map, I never really thought of the importance of those rivers. But there are rivers that flow, and I like looking at it this way. I gave a presentation a few years ago, and the oceanographer of the Navy picked up on it, and we've been saying to think of this as the Gulf of Mexico on steroids. Where we have one Mississippi River that drains the entire central watershed, they have 3 rivers almost equivalent to the Mississippi, the Ob, the Yenisei, the Lena, that reach to the southern reaches of Russia. They haven't been of use in international trade because they're frozen in the north. That's beginning to change. And Russia's looking at that. Now, we talk about hydrocarbons in the Arctic, and that's become a really hot topic when people want to push a button. Up in the upper right, in the Yenisei Valley, you'll see the darkest gray. That's where the richest deposit of natural gas is. Not in the central Arctic, not in the continental shelf beyond the EEZ. It's on land and within the EEZ, so that it's not really something that there's any contention about. In fact, most of the rich areas of potential hydrocarbons are within the exclusive economic zone. So there's not really a fight for energy in the form of oil and natural gas. There is the desire to lay out where sovereignty is, but it's not a rush to gather that oil. They know it's there. When they need it, they'll look for it. I do want to point out a few things here. And they're small, but we talk a little bit about protecting the area. And that's protecting not just in national security, but maritime security. So Russia has been building bases. Mishmit, Wrangel Island, Pevek, Tixi, a little bit in Katanga, on the new Siberian islands, opening airfields in Franz Josef Land and the northern islands and on Nova Zemlya. And then in the more developed areas, in fact, they actually have to put in for their own use the search and rescue facilities. So we're seeing a lot of development. You may have seen stories about the huge Russian base put in on Kotelny Island. That huge base can hold 250 people. And it will have to support whatever military goes there, Coast Guard, border guards, scientific researchers who overwinter in that area. The other bases are about 150 people. In total, those bases across the north account for less than a battalion of people, which is not a large unit. So when news stories talk about the militarization, often it helps get clicks. But from a real sense, those are just having the people out there. And in fact, as a country trying to prove sovereignty, it really helps to actually have people on the islands you claim. So there's another reason for that. And then there's the air defense. But much like North America, where Alaska and Canada have a huge radar network, Russia's putting the same in. Russia has 2 brigades of Arctic troops on the Kola Peninsula. We have 2 brigades of Arctic troops in Alaska. So it's not a race. They're basically sitting there trying to figure out how to manage this area. Just to get to the rivers, you'll see that the capacity of the 3 rivers really is about 3 times the capacity of the entire Mississippi River Valley in the U.S. Given that that reaches down to areas that are productive of minerals and have the potential for being agriculture or timber, and reach down into some of the industrial areas of Siberia, you can see that if you use the U.S. as a guide, you can see what Russia is looking for in terms of economic development. In fact, their transportation policy is a lattice. We know the Trans-Siberian Railway, and we also know of its limited capacity and age. North-south, it's difficult to put land connections in because you have to build over permafrost and over ice. That rivers will provide that north-south linkage. And in the north, the Northern Sea Route. The Northern Sea Route is more properly, in this case, called the Northeast Passage. The Northern Sea Route is an administrative area that starts at the Kara Sea and runs to the Bering Strait. And we have 3 types. One that goes along the coast and visits the ports. One that transits still near to land and through the islands, but transits from one end to the other. And then a polar route that just goes from the Bering Sea to Murmansk or on down to Europe. The Russians, though, in their policy refer to the Northern Sea Route as a national transportation corridor, and we miss that sometimes. That's stopping at all the ports as part of the development policy. It's connecting those rivers and harbors and bases and towns. It's the network for development. This is, almost all these are new ships. These are how the Northern Sea Route will be accessed. The first in the upper left, however, is the oldest ship up there. It's the Sevmorput. It's a nuclear-powered cargo ship. The interesting thing for me is not that it's nuclear-powered, but that it's designed to carry cargo on lighters that can be put on from sea, sent into ports. So they don't have to have a deep draft port, which is lacking in those areas. So that has just been refurbished. It's going into service again starting this year and this season. We'll see how it really gets used. To the right is one of the ice-breaking tanker or cargo ships for Norilsk, the major nickel producer on the Yenisei River. On the far right, you see an LNG tanker that is in construction now for servicing the Yamal energy deposits, and that will serve East Asia as well as Europe. So one of the things that they're getting out of the Northern Sea Route is diversity of markets. We spent a long time trying to split China and Russia in the 1970s, and now that connection is possible again through trade, not through military. The small image there is a nuclear power plant, a floating one. The first one's supposed to go into Pevek. It's 60 megawatts, and it will provide, actually it will allow them to shut down a coal-fired new power plant farther south. And it's the first of a series that will be produced to provide energy in those areas. In the 1970s, one of the reasons for the Northern Sea Route was simply to get coal and energy to the bases in the north. So having an alternative source of energy for that is very important. What you won't see here are ice-capable naval ships, warships. Russia has constructed a small Coast Guard cutter, smaller than a frigate, and unlike previous Coast Guard ships, it's not festooned with all the weaponry, missiles and torpedoes that used to be on the frigate-class Coast Guard vessels. It's a small law enforcement vessel, capable of staying at sea for a month, going up to 12,000 miles. It's an ocean patrol vessel, roughly equivalent to a medium-endurance cutter in the United States. To the left, though, is their bigger Coast Guard ship. This is a design. They haven't actually let the contract yet, but it's very similar to the Svalbard. It's about a 6,500-ton ice-breaking ship capable of about 1.2 meters of ice, azopod propulsion, so it can back up and break ice. It is capable, as an option, of putting a standard-sized container with a missile in it if necessary, but that's the limit, really the limit of its weaponry. It's still a Coast Guard function rather than a military function, and which leads me to say that the issue of strategic forces is an issue in itself, that when we talk militarization, we need to keep the two issues differently. The boots on the ground and the ships in the sea are more of a law enforcement function and a domestic protection force. The missile boats and the bombers are a strategic issue that won't be decided within an Arctic forum, but the others might. To the right is the new class of Arctic icebreaker, 30-some megawatt, 60 megawatt propulsion. They're building 3 of them. They will replace eventually all 5 of the remaining active icebreakers. And at the bottom, and I love this. I mean, I grew up in the 50s, and the cool kids had hot rods that had cherry red metallic paint. And I looked at this and I just fell in love. That is designed to be the icebreaker that goes across the pole, that goes from the Bering Strait all the way to Murmansk and leads other icebreakers in building a channel. It's twice the power of that new construction icebreaker. They only are talking about one right now, and this would actually go with other guides behind it. But that's what they're looking at, is making the North accessible and they're doing it for their own internal development. Some of the policies: use of the Arctic zone as a resource base upon which to build. Preservation as a zone of peace and cooperation. Conservation of ecosystems, and using the Northern Sea route. It comes up in every policy that is remotely applicable in the Arctic. Getting to a bit more detail: expansion of oil and gas development to get the funds coming in. Fisheries, because the Barents Sea is their big fishery resource. Improve competitiveness of the Northern Sea route, which is why these ships are being built. Reduce environmental harm, which has led to a lot of cleanup, particularly on Franz Josef Land. And improving the information and communications network. That when you have places where you can't have roads between your communities, you do have to have an electronic network. Maritime doctrine. I was very impressed with this because coming to this as a sailor, you look at this and think, okay, yeah, they'll have the strategic rocket forces, but they'll need investment in shipping. The Maritime Border Service is to become a real Coast Guard, not the old border guard, but a Coast Guard comparable to the United States. And international agreements and confidence-building measures are being developed. In short, we can't go back to the enclosure and containment position. We have to develop this as an area of cooperation. Trade will be a major part of that, not just with the West as it's been, but with China and East Asia, perhaps moving farther after that. I knew that not all of the Macintosh functions would transfer over. Sustainable development is key to this. The combination of law of the sea and the UN Conference on Environment and Development are the framework for the Arctic. Where I have a lot of issues that we want to engage with Russia on: maritime safety, the mentions of ongoing binding agreements and developments of new ones. We need to collaborate on the development and implementation of regulations. We're doing that through the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. We have the opportunity to invest in shared Arctic domain awareness. This will be a touchy subject because it does get into defense issues, but has a lot of promise for us all. And to negotiate the agreements that we need to build a secure area, one where we can know what's going on.
We really need to wrap up.
And that's, I beat you to it.
Okay. Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caitlyn. And now we'll hear from one of the top Russian scholars who deals on Arctic issues.
If I were the social constructivist, whom I'm not, but if I were a social constructivist, I would say that we are living in the world of different perceptions and misperceptions, stereotypes, prejudices, and so on. So let me start from listing some stereotypes about Russian Arctic policies and strategies. Actually, some of the speakers already have addressed to this issue, and thank you very much for doing that, especially exploding the myth about the arms race in the Arctic and the Russian militarist aspirations in the region. But anyway, let me just mention the most popular myths or stereotypes about Russia's role in the region. First, Russia is an expansionist, revisionist country that aims at establishing its control over the huge Arctic natural resources. And people are referring to the things like Arthur Chillingar's plant and the titanium flag on the bottom of the Arctic Ocean in 2007. Moscow claims on the Lomonosov and the Mendeleev ridges, like the Russian submissions to the UN Commission on the Continental Shelf in 2001 and 2015, etc. But as my colleagues already explained, it's just a natural outcome of Russia's attempts to be sovereign in this region, and the other countries like Denmark, like Canada, like Norway already is doing that. Norway actually already settled down its maritime borders and claims for continental shelf in 2009. So Russia is just following the pattern, and it's not the exception of the rule in the region. The second stereotype is that Russia is a militarist power, because Russia is weak economically, technologically, so it makes emphasis on military power to achieve its interests in the region. People refer to things like resumption of air and maritime space patrolling, starting from 2007, modernization of the northern fleet, like creation of a special Arctic command in the north, like deployment of the Arctic Brigade in the region, renovation of border and military infrastructures in the region, and so on. But also, I guess the colleagues from other panels, they will address these issues and try to explain that actually the real purpose of Russia in that regard is just to modernize its armed forces deployed in the region, make them more efficient, modern, better equipped, better trained for the Arctic purposes, not just to restore the Soviet-type a huge military machine for the global confrontation with the United States, with NATO countries. So just in many cases, or in many regards, Russia just follow the same trends which adhere to the other armed forces in the region, like, for example, Norwegian or Danish or Finnish or Swedish armed forces, Canadian armed forces, so on. Caitlyn already mentioned that most of these military installations or military infrastructure in the region of dual use, both for military purposes and for civilian ones, like search and rescue operations, which is just part of Russian commitments to the search and rescue operations in the Arctic Ocean, the agreement which was concluded at the auspices of the Arctic Council in 2011. Then also a lot of stereotypes about Russia's role as an energy power in the region. One of the myths is that Russia is the emerging world energy hegemon because of the vast Arctic natural resources. And on the other hand, we have an opposite stereotype that Russia is a colossus with the feet of clay, because the Arctic oil and the gas deposits are overestimated. There's a dramatic fall in oil prices. The Arctic oil and gas are too expensive. Some experts, they believe that they can be profitable only if the cost will be $100 or $110 per barrel. Also because of the U.S. shale revolution and the other things. So how to combine these two approaches, for me, is unclear. I think that's Russia just following its own philosophy in this region, trying to develop its own energy base without just thinking about some kind of aggressive or ambitious plans to become the Arctic Saudi Arabia or something like that. And also, just let me mention one more stereotype is that Russia's Arctic policies in the high north, they are run by oil, gas, and mining companies which do not care of indigenous peoples or environment. That's also a wrong stereotype. I guess other panelists, they will address this issue, trying to explain that Russia made great strides in developing its own concept of sustainable development in this region, although it's not still efficient. We need a lot of money to accomplish this tasks and missions, but Russia already has developed that kind of quite advanced concept with the three dimensions: the energy dimension, environmental dimension, humanitarian dimension, and social one. Let me briefly describe the Russian theoretical approaches to the Arctic politics. I would say that the Russian thinking is not some kind of a monolith. It's a quite diverse landscape, and we have several approaches to this issue. For example, we have the so-called value-based approach, the neoliberal schools that are close to it in Russia. They believe that Arctic is the common humankind's heritage or asset, and the main priorities for the Arctic cooperation should be environmental protection and the human dimension. Regional institutions such as the Arctic Council, the Barents Sea Arctic Council, should be a part of the global governance system. On the other hand, we also have an interest-based approach, so-called neo-realists, who believe that each Arctic and non-Arctic country aims at protection its national interests in the region, and Russia should just follow the other countries in defending its own national interests in the region. And the priorities should be things like a division of the continental shelf and delimitation of maritime territories, control over the maritime routes and passages, military presence in the region, etc. But in fact, what we have now in Russia at the level of decision makers, we have a hybrid or mixed version of these two approaches. If you look at the texts of the Russian Arctic doctrines, like the concept of 2008 or 2013, you can find the traces of both approaches. It's just quite pragmatic mixture of these. The same, we can identify the so-called securitized approach and the desecuritized approaches to the Arctic politics. The first one believes that each Arctic problem could be seen from the national security point of view. And we should distinguish between hard and soft security challenges, but everything is security, everything relates to security. The opposite approach believes that we should not exaggerate the security issues, and most of the Arctic problems, they do not have a security flavor or background, and most of these problems, they can be solved beyond the security context in a normal way. And again, if you look at the Russian official documents concerning the Arctic, you can see the mixture or combination of these two approaches, these two strategies, 2008 and 2013. Let me skip a description of Russian national interest because partially they were already described by previous speakers. Just several slides demonstrating the importance of this region for the Russian national interests. Huge natural resources, industrial potential, the importance of the Northern Sea route. Actually, Caitlyn is completely right. We have a different understanding of Northern Sea route in the legal terms and in the conventional sense. Here we have a map, which is official map from the website of the Russian administration of the Northern Sea route. And there's several versions of National Sea route. We have several of them. Okay. This map demonstrating the importance of the environmental issues in the area. If you look to this map, it almost coincides with the map which Marlene demonstrated. I mean, the map of the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation. So these maps, they are almost the same, with the exception of the eastern part of the Arctic zone. But the western part is full of environmental problems, which were inherited from the Soviet past. Okay, let me briefly address to the drivers of Russian future Arctic strategy, which already have been briefly touched. I guess the first priority is the climate change mitigation, and we have a lot of strategies on doing that. Then the second, making the Arctic Russia strategic, Arctic Russia strategic resource bases. But actually, we have a lot of discussions about that because we have some schools who don't believe that the Arctic should be that kind of strategic resource basis because of the risks in the environmental area. So these alternative schools, they suggest to pay more attention to the indigenous peoples, the people who populate the Russian Arctic, so about the humanitarian and social dimensions. Then the need for sustainable development of the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation. We already have a doctrine, concepts, but we should operationalize it, and we have to fund it, so substantiate it with money, not with only declarations. And finally, making the Arctic a region of peace and international cooperation, because Russia is deeply concerned about the current security situation in the Arctic, and Russia doesn't want to get it worse, and interested in amelioration of this environment and strategic culture, strategic environment in the region. Let me skip the description of these priorities. Just let me move directly to the areas of the potential U.S.-Russian cooperation, and let me finish my presentation by this some kind of hypothetical part of it. First, in the security area, I would suggest that both countries should decrease in military presence and activities in the Arctic, especially in the Barents Sea, where we have a lot of military activities and installations, and I guess it's a critical area for both countries. Then I believe that it's a good idea to develop confidence and security building measures in the Arctic, not only in the Barents Sea, but also in other parts of the Arctic region. I actually can think about the extension of the arms control regime in the region. Maybe the conventional forces in Europe Treaty of 1990 and its adaptation variant of 1999 could be helpful in developing that kind of regime. I guess it's important also that intelligence information sharing should be developed between the two countries about the dangerous activities in the region. If you look at the economy and trade spheres, I believe that we have a lot of promising projects in energy sector, mining sector, telecommunications, which is very important for development, especially Northern Sea Route. Also, infrastructures of the Northern Sea Route and the circumpolar air routes. Unfortunately, because of the Western sanctions, most of the projects which were already in the air, they were frozen. And finally, legal issues. I guess that both the U.S. and Russia have to do their homework, like to ratify the UNCLOS, United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, on the American part, and on the Russian part, we should ratify this the U.S.-Soviet Treaty on the delimitation of the Bering Sea, which was concluded in 1990, but till now, to the moment, is not ratified by the Russian side. And also, we should accomplish the delimitation of the maritime space in the Chukchi Sea, which is, I mean, the zones which are located beyond the 200 nautical miles, which already more or less regulated. Also, we have a lot of prospects in environmental protection and monitoring. In the research area, such as things like large-scale studies of the Arctic climate change, the status of the of Arctic wild animals and plants, social, economic, and demographic trends in the far north, preservation of the unique way of the life and culture of people of the north, search and rescue operations, which already mentioned here, combating oil spills and other man-made disasters, I mean, potentially. And finally, the very important thing for Russia now is the proper implementation of the Polar Code, which has been approved by the International Maritime Organization last year. We have a lot of challenges here, and at the same time, a lot of opportunities to cooperate. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. So we got a late start. I'm going to suggest that we allow the Q&A to go later than it's listed on the program, and if that means that we start the second panel a few minutes late, I think that's okay. We have just a huge variety of issues that have been raised, and already some agreement and some disagreement about what this means for U.S. and Russia relations in the future. And so now we'd be delighted to take questions from the audience. Carly, is someone here who can? Yeah, do we have a microphone? Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. So raise your hand, and Carly will come around with the mic. Please remember that this is on the record, and we would ask you before you ask your question to please identify yourself so that we have a sense of what perspective you're coming from. And I saw a hand up over here. Yes.
Hi, Michelle Fuchs with Schiller Institute, EIR, and LaRouche. My question is on the topic of the potential for the Arctic to not just be a place to avoid conflict, but to develop a potential for peace, in particular between the United States and Russia. I know a couple of the speakers addressed this, but as we know, the media tends to suggest Russia warmongering with the United States over at the Arctic. But what I've seen is Dmitry Rogozin picking up on Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative proposal from the 80s, but saying that Russia and the United States could work together on strategic defense from asteroids.
Great. So let's have that question. Please keep
And-
your questions brief
Oh,
so that we have
I
a
understand.
number of people
but he
who are
said
able.
that this would be an opportunity to dissuade from confrontational tendencies if we were to work together on that.
That's
I
a
think the
great
Arctic is
question.
also a place for that.
That's a great question, and let's allow the panel to address that particular question. So, yes. So Carly can take back the mic. Yes. Who wants to talk about that? Paul.
The concept of the media is interesting. It's appropriate being in New York. 2013 began working with the New York Times to write an op-ed on the Arctic and Russia and the very topic that you mentioned. And I said I would write about peace, and I talked to the New York Times and I said, you know, it's really interesting. Anytime we talk about peace, the media will turn around and talk about war. So I was talking about peace and cooperation and strategies and so on and so forth. So, but the New York Times, in that example, said that they have the final say at the title of the piece. The end of the title was preventing an Arctic Cold War. So, you know, if the concept of peace is discussed, the media won't sell it. So the media is, I think, culpable in the way the Arctic is portrayed. If you talk to the diplomats, the people that are actually negotiating discussions about the Arctic, they will, to a person, refer to the Arctic as a region of low tension. And there's a phrase that's been used for a number of years since Johannes Gahr Store, former foreign minister of Norway, which is high north, low tension. So in a sense, there is a dichotomy between what is actually going on the ground between the diplomats and the way that the public is being introduced to this.
Can I just add on that element also to bring on the reverse side, which is the way the Russian media are also portraying. And I think on that it's relatively similar to what you were describing. I mean, the Russian media, especially on TV, the Arctic is often presented also as a place of conflict, even if it's so that's interesting, because that's where I was trying to bring this notion of also we need to look at what is for domestic audience, what is for external consumption. The Russian media very often for domestic audience are bringing a kind of narrative that Russian interests in the Arctic are endangered by the West activities, and therefore Russia has to defend. So it's very much a Cold War narrative. At the same time, if you look at the Russian media on what they are portraying about Russian activities abroad, it's very much more about like we are recognized as a big power because we are doing cooperation. So I think this media issue is in fact on both sides of the picture. I mean, both of them on both sides are having kind of difficulties discussing cooperation because that's not what brings the attention of the public.
I'd like to skip away from the media aspect, but keep an emphasis on the problem of an East-West focus with its history of conflict and tension. Within Europe, the Euro-Barents process, which extends not just among countries, but to the regional groups, to the subnational groups, leads to a lot more cooperation and network building. It's easier to do when you have a high population density, as that part of the Arctic does, but we need to see something like that working on the Pacific end of the Arctic that involves Yukon and Northwest Territories, Alaska, Chukotka, and the northern part of Sakha Republic. That there, where they face common problems, where they have different mixes of indigenous people, they have different development issues, but they all are far enough away from their capitals where they have a little more leeway to collaborate and develop some policy recommendations. The hope has been that a revived Northern Forum might be able to take that role, to give a little more leeway to the people who actually live in the Arctic, as opposed to those who manage it from their capitals, where they have all the other pressures brought to bear. So we do need a new type of governance for the international region that reflects the people who are there and affected by it and have an interest in cooperation that may not be reflected as much when you bring large national issues into that.
Other questions? Over here, Nora?
Hi there, I'm Nora Ben-Sahel from the School of International Service at American University. I think the discussion about Russia's activities in the Arctic is probably about right. I defer to all of you as the experts on what Russia is doing in the region. But I find the tone of this panel slightly odd in that what Russia is doing and the degree of cooperation we're talking about in the Arctic seems rather divorced from the broader Russian foreign policy, which has been very militaristic, very aggressive elsewhere. And I know we'll talk about the military issues later on this afternoon, but I'm wondering if you could respond to how your belief that the technical cooperation and the prospects for peace and cooperation in the region square or don't square with what we see clearly as trends in broader Russian foreign policy.
Good question.
Ladies first.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think there are several of us who mentioned that maybe in an indirect way. Of course, the militarization you are mentioning is mostly on the way Russia manages its relation with what it's called its near abroad. So the kind of Eurasian region and the fact that Russia wants to be recognized as the regional hegemon for the post-Soviet space. On many other aspects, Russian foreign policy is quite, I think, on a relatively negotiative elements on many of its elements, and the Russian perspective has always been that the Arctic should be preserved from the West, which is, of course, Russia's interest in being sure that the way the West will be looking at Russia's position in the near abroad will be dissociated from what Russia is doing elsewhere, so that the Russian strategy, I think it has relatively failed, because you can see that the impact of the Ukrainian crisis has been slowing down the cooperation at high level that was going on between the US and Russia in the Arctic. So on that, the Russian perspective of kind of isolating the regional spaces has failed. And I think that's that's a good lesson for the Russian foreign policy to see that you cannot isolate the spaces, because then the way other countries are looking at your own actions kind of may be different. But I think on the Arctic, Russia has been relatively really cooperative, and this kind of military escalation that we have seen in the Arctic is mostly a kind of domestic audience issues, and very much, as we said, a kind of narrative that has reasons that are not really militaristic, but purely kind of developmental issues. So, but I would like to give the floor to the others. Yeah. Alexander.
We're all polite here. Good question. Up until Crimea and Ukraine, the Arctic was insulated from other types of global geopolitical discussions. It wasn't involved with anything in the Middle East. It wasn't involved with anything in Asia. But after Crimea, there was effectively an inconsistency in U.S. policy. So on one hand, the United States president has an executive order that talks about cooperation in the Arctic, and at the same time, the concept of sanctions has been introduced into the Arctic in the form of companies that would be doing business with Rosneft in the Kara Sea. So in effect, the issues of Crimea, Ukraine have intruded into the Arctic. So if we look at the Arctic as a region on Earth, I would argue that the Arctic is of high strategic importance because of the presence of these nuclear submarines, and that it is important for the region to be maintained as a region of peace and stability. And if we look at every single Russian military doctrine or national security policy that relates to the Arctic specifically, since Gorbachev, they've all been the same. Every single one has talked about the Arctic as a zone of peace and cooperation. Very specifically, if we look at the Arctic Council as a forum for dialogue itself, a high-level forum, it went through a phase of discussion that was at the level of mid-level diplomats on the ministerial meetings until 2009, at which point Secretary of State Clinton and all of the other foreign ministers at the time began meeting together. And those discussions continued unabated at the level of Foreign Minister and Secretary of State until 2015, at which point Foreign Minister Lavrov did not go to Canada. My hope, and I mentioned this yesterday in Washington, talking with the representative to the White House, Mark Brzezinski, who is the head of the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, in a public forum just like this one, that it is not to be taken for granted that Foreign Minister Lavrov would come to the table in 2017 for the Arctic Council Ministerial that the United States will host in Alaska. So a component of going forward is for the United States to reunite the interaction at the level of head of foreign minister. The next step, however, is that the heads of state would meet, the Arctic heads of state would meet. And if they do meet, the question is what they would talk about. My sense is that the most valuable thing that the Arctic heads of state could talk about together is that the Arctic is to be maintained as a region of peace and stability. It is likely, possible/likely, that during the Finnish chairmanship that will follow the U.S. chairmanship starting in 2017, that Finland would invite a meeting among all of the Arctic heads of state. And President Niinisto from Finland had been in Saalfjord with President Grimson of Iceland and President Putin. President Putin had extended an invitation to all of the Arctic heads of state. So my hope is that the Arctic heads of state will meet together and define that the Arctic is to be maintained as a region of peace and stability, which would mean that issues like Ukraine and Crimea would not intrude in the geopolitics of the Arctic.
We have a lot of questions, so if the other panelists could just be brief in there.
One quickly to add one point. The Arctic is a maritime domain. It's a body of water surrounded by land. And to a degree, that forces it to be more cooperative. Sea services work together because the ocean is more powerful than any navy, that they have to help. They have to do combined operations for safety, for emergency response. So that we see in the Arctic, it's the Navy and Coast Guard who are emphatic that they can work together. The establishment of the Arctic Coast Guard Forum last fall, I think goes a long way to implementing that, of making sure that there are common operations, communication, networking among those organizations, and that they can work together. It's very encouraging. The Coast Guard's very thrilled with it, and point out that they were at the table with the head of the Russian Coast Guard, and that they look forward to working on that in spite of the economic sanctions that may be imposed, that we can't fail to protect the environment, we can't fail to protect life at sea. And so we are going to have that cooperation there.
Do you want to say something?
Just a brief note. Well, actually, the Russian side is quite happy about the Arctic cooperation, regardless of the Korean crisis, especially under the chairmanship of the U.S. in the Arctic Council. And a lot of specific concrete projects are underway. The only exception is that because of the Western sanctions, these promising projects in the Russian Arctic energy sector were stopped or frozen. And Moscow does not understand why, because the U.S. and other Western companies, they shoot into the leg, its own leg, because the American companies like ExxonMobil or Shell, they lost billions of dollars in exploring in the Russian Arctic. So that's the only subject of concern.
Let me just end this part of the discussion by saying that, even in the Cold War, there was a lot of cooperation that happened between the United States and the Soviet Union that we tend to forget about. Even at the height of militarization, we had agreements on arms control, agreements on, limiting nuclear tests and on limiting nuclear proliferation and on dangerous military activities at sea and so forth. And so the two are not necessarily in contrast with each other. Yes, in the back.
Kim, who?
Back corner. Right there. Yeah. Yes, him.
Yes, Jim Dingman, Pacifica Radio. I'd like to ask you, what is the state of cooperation and thought about down the road if there is a Deepwater Horizon type event in the midst of all this sort of gold rush, oil rush into the Arctic Circle? Suppose we have a disaster, an environmental disaster. What are the thoughts of dealing with that? And what ideas have been talked about, or have they sort of been in abeyance?
Good question.
One of the reasons for forming the Arctic Coast Guard Forum was because Coast Guards tend to be on the the point of the spear in response was to ensure that they'd work in conjunction with the oil spill response agreement to prepare for that. But there's an infrastructure need in there, and it's been pointed out that the U.S. and Canada are not proceeding the way Russia is in developing response tools, particularly a class of multi-purpose salvage tugs that can be used for rescue, that can be used for oil spill response, so that there's a lot more work to be done. We are just at the beginning of this. I mean, it's a long-term process to develop the Arctic response capability just a bit ahead of our capability to cause harm. So it's not all there in place. We aren't sure how it's all going to be done, but everyone's committed to taking the next step of developing their own response and coordinating it with the others. That's about the state of it right now.
After the Deepwater Horizon, there was a commission, and one of the commission papers, staff paper number 5, took the lessons learned from the Deepwater Horizon and interpreted them in the case of the Arctic. So if we look at the Arctic, for example, in the case of the United States, there is no icebreaker capacity to assist. And so one of the conclusions from that report was effectively the fox would be in charge of the hen house. I think it's important to set expectations. The Arctic is a cold region, which means any bacterial decay of oil in the water is going to be relatively slow. It's ice covered. It's going to be complicated to clean up spills, which is going to move around under the ice. And the reality is, no matter how good the governments are in developing contingency plans, we seem to exceed them consistently in terms of accidents. And I think setting expectations is the reality is, if there are energy exploration activities in the Arctic, there will be accidents. And the likelihood is that we will not be able to respond effectively.
Question in the back, the woman who's sitting on the end.
Thank you. So my name is Esmeralda Colombo. I'm from Columbia Law School. And my question is to Professor Sergunin. You mentioned environmental degradation in the western region of Russia. And I was wondering what can be done about that, since it dates back to the USSR era, and if you believe there should be cooperation in that, even if that area just belongs to Russia's jurisdiction, and what protocols might be in place for the cleanup. And a second question would be, is there an incentive for the Arctic states to combat climate change? Thank you.
Thank you. I think because we're running low on time, we should take a couple more questions. And so if the panelists could just think about their answers and gather the questions that they'll be answering to, if we could take maybe 2 more before turning to the panel. And I saw a gentleman in the back who's had his hand up for a while.
William Janis, adjunct professor at Fordham. It actually dovetails on the prior question. In light of the global climate accord in Paris and the possibility of more divestment of fossil fuel companies and stranded assets, how do you see that impacting a hydrocarbon fossil fuel development in the Arctic?
And Austin.
Thanks, Austin Long, Columbia University. This builds a little bit on Nora's question earlier. What are the realistic prospects for expanding cooperation? I understand there's Coast Guard cooperation. We had cooperation at the height of the Cold War, but just to take one example, the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty was mentioned, but Russia has suspended compliance with that for nearly a decade. Both sides accuse one another of violating the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, et cetera. So are there realistically any significant prospects for renewed arms control specific to the Arctic?
Very good question. So now it seems like Alexander got most of the questions, so should we start with him, and then if others want to contribute also?
Yeah, just briefly, the answer to the first question about the environmental protection in the western part of the Russian Arctic sector. Actually, there was a cooperation between Russia and the Western countries in the framework of G8 on nuclear safety and the the decommissioned Russian submarine nuclear reactors. But what I meant in this case is just the pollution, industrial pollution made by the Russian industrial centers located on the Kola Peninsula, Norilsk, and the like, the similar activities. So, I mean, the Russian legislation, environmental legislation became much stricter, and already a lot of environmental programs are doing there. And I think that every future industrial activities will be under the public expertise. Look, for example, the Prilazromne oil rig, when the extraction of oil in this platform, which is offshore platform, started only when not only the official environmental expertise were taken, but also the public environmental expertise was satisfied with the conditions surrounding this platform. As far as the CFE treaty is concerned, I guess it just of course, I know that it was suspended by the Russian initiative, but the experience which we got in this area is unique, and I think that the principles of this treaty and the approaches to the arms control regimes are quite useful and could be applicable to this region as well. Why not? I mean, nothing precludes us from doing that. All we need is just a good political will, nothing more.
I'd just like to note that with those two new Arctic brigades that Russia has established, Finland and Norway each inspected one of those in the last 2 months, I believe, under the provisions of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So we are getting some more visibility, understanding of what the bases are there. We have a lot to do in that because right now it's, again, Russia's really developing their Arctic resources as a Northern Command. And we have an opportunity to follow that and keep it open, but we do have to work at that.
If I can add also on Austin's question, I think the only aspect of U.S.-Russia cooperation that can function without being too much affected by the general deterioration is only things related to soft security, and that's really the Russian Ministry of Emergency Situation, which is the key actor, and it has been the backbone for cooperation on that, because they know very well that they are the only part of the kind of security services in the broad sense that can work with the West and be kind of the leader of the cooperation with the West without being too much affected by the kind of general military, nuclear-related issues or purely kind of armed force. So they are the key actors on that, and they have been the key actors for everything related to improving law enforcement agencies, brigades, and so on in the region, and Coast Guard cooperation.
And one of the examples of that is in the United States, the Navy does not enforce law. If we capture somebody in violation of U.S. law, we have to have a law enforcement officer, and that'll be a Coast Guard person. Well, extending that to international areas, the Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard, has been looking to develop a process of having Russian law enforcement officials on U.S. Coast Guard vessels and U.S. law enforcement people on Russian Coast Guard vessels, both north and, or eventually north of the Bering Strait, but currently to the south of it. Well, that's getting into a degree of cooperation that I think extends much more than keeping appraised of each other's programs. It's actually cooperation in law enforcement. And they're pursuing that in spite of the other tensions in other parts of the world.
Well, we've run a little bit over time, and so I would ask people to please take a break relatively quickly. When we come back, we'll be having the panel that focuses on energy issues, and I want to give a special note of thanks to the Columbia SIPA Center on Global Energy Policy, which gave us a great deal of help in organizing this panel in particular, but also the conference as a whole. And so if we could just reconvene in 5 or 10 minutes, and we'll start on the next panel. Thank you so much to our speakers, and thank you to you for your great engaged questions.